Imagine this for a second. Everything you think you know about the first cities, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, might be built on a simple mistake. Not a conspiracy. Not a secret cabal rewriting textbooks. Just the kind of wrong assumption that hardens into common knowledge. Because everyone repeats it long enough. Because what if civilization didn't begin with farmers slowly figuring out cooperation, step by step, generation by generation? What if it began with survivors, people who already knew how to live together, organize together, build together? What if the first Sumerians didn't invent cities? What if they remembered them? Before Mesopotamia rose, an entire world drowned, and the people who made it out carried something with them. Knowledge. The kind of knowledge that doesn't just change how you live. It changes what's possible. So dangerous, so disruptive, that history might have buried it deeper than the ocean ever could. And here's the part one love. The strongest proof doesn't come from legends or fringe websites or trust me bro theories. It comes from the bottom of the North Sea. But before we trace this journey, from a drowned world to the first cities, quick pause. If you're drawn to stories where the ground beneath our feet is hiding secrets the history books forgot, tap like and subscribe. These are the kinds of videos where we go slow, we go deep, and we connect dots most people never even think to line up. And if you're still with me right now, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what hour is keeping you company tonight. I always love imagining a scatter across the same world that Dogland's refugees once crossed. Different cities, different rooms, same curiosity. All of us chasing the same question. What came before the beginning? All right, let's begin. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, Northern Europe wasn't the scatter of islands we see today. It was home to Dogland, a landmass larger than modern Britain, stretching from Scotland to Denmark to the Netherlands. And it wasn't some barren wasteland either. Sediment cores pulled from beneath the North Sea revealed dense forests, wide rivers, seasonal lakes, an entire living landscape. Not imagination, not myth, physical evidence. And within that evidence, signs of human life. Tens of thousands of Mesolithic people lived there. They weren't wandering cluelessly through empty woods. They were tuned into the land's rhythms in a way that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. They hunted reindeer along migration routes. They fished with engineered traps. They gathered at communal sites, places that look less like random camps and more like meeting grounds, suggesting complex social organization. In other words, this wasn't a handful of isolated families. This was a network, a cultural world. Then the ice melted. At first it was slow, sea levels rising year by year, decade by decade, coasts shrinking, lowlands flooding, populations pushed inland, adjusting their lives, shifting their routines, adapting as best they could. But Dogland didn't die quietly. Around 6,200 BC, something happened that made adaptation impossible. Off the coast of Norway, a massive underwater landslide, the Storegga Slide, triggered a mega tsunami. And this wasn't some dramatic movie wave you can outrun if you sprint fast enough. We're talking walls of water possibly reaching 20 meters high, slamming into what remained of Dogland, flooding valleys, erasing settlements, obliterating a world that has stood for millennia. Archaeologists have mapped this destruction. Geologists have dated it. Paleoenvironmentalists have reconstructed it. So the catastrophe itself isn't really the mystery anymore. The mystery is the question nobody seems comfortable asking out loud. Where did the survivors go? Because when you look at what happens next in the archaeological record, something strange starts to appear. Not in Northern Europe, where Dogland once stood, but far to the southeast, in the region that would one day become the cradle of civilization. Right around the time Dogland vanishes from history, the Fertile Crescent shows signs of change. A sudden influx of new settlers. Population models showing surges that don't fully make sense. Tool traditions shifting in ways that look intrusive, like something arrived. And then you notice the details. Microlithic blade industries, remarkably similar to those used in Northern Europe, start appearing in the Levant and Mesopotamia. Pottery styles begin echoing motifs that feel Atlantic, not identical, not copy-paste, but close enough to raise your eyebrows if you care about this kind of thing. Bone carvings show symbolic marks that had mostly lived inside Dogland's cultural sphere. Mainstream archaeology often treats this kind of overlap as coincidence, parallel development, independent innovation, different people solving similar problems in similar ways. And sometimes that's fair, but then you line up the dates. Dogland drowns around 6,200 BC, and within centuries, the Near East begins showing signals of displaced populations arriving from the northwest. And within a few thousand years after that, the first cities appear in Sumer. Here's where it gets eerie. They don't appear gradually. Not like awkward prototypes that slowly improve. Not like people stumbling into urban life by accident. They appear suddenly, functional, structured, organized, as if the builders already knew what they were doing. Irrigation systems with no clear prototypes. Urban planning that looks implemented, not experimented with. Accounting methods that show up in mature form. Astronomical alignments suggesting long-term sky watching. Writing systems that feel like they skip developmental stages. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying Sumer didn't innovate. They absolutely did. They created something extraordinary. But the question is, how do you build something that advanced so fast, with so few visible baby steps? Because Sumer doesn't feel like a first draft. It feels like a rebuild. And then there's genetics, because genetics doesn't care about our narratives. It doesn't care what we want the story to be. It just records what happened. Studies of ancient DNA have turned up something unexpected. Traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. Genetic signatures associated with Northern and Western Europe appearing inside early Near Eastern populations where, according to the neatest migration models, they shouldn't be. Ghost populations contributing to early farmers. Anomalous markers in some of the earliest Mesopotamian communities that don't fit the local story. Someone from the Northwest reached the Near East during the same window Dogland was collapsing. And before we go any further down that road, there's one more piece. Because evidence isn't only buried in soil or encoded in genomes. Sometimes it survives as a story. The Sumerians had a flood myth. You probably heard echoes of it. Zayusadra, Utnapishtim, the boat, the warning, the catastrophe. Humanity preserved through disaster. For a long time, scholars treated these as symbolic moral tales. Cosmic metaphors about order and chaos, God and humans. But what if they weren't just symbols? What if they were memories? Because the Sumerian flood myth doesn't describe a gentle, seasonal river flood. It describes a world swallowed by water. Survivors fleeing by boat. Knowledge preserved through catastrophe. And it describes a catastrophe as something that happened in a distant homeland, somewhere far away, now lost beneath the waves. So now look at what we have. Archaeology confirms a drowned land. Geology confirms a catastrophic event. Genetics hints at unexpected movement. Material culture shows northern fingerprints in the south. And mythology preserves a memory of a flood that sounds less like poetry and more like trauma. So the question isn't whether displaced people could have traveled from Dogland to Mesopotamia. The question is, what did they bring with them? And if the first cities weren't invented but rebuilt, then what kind of world existed before them? To answer that, we have to go back past Sumer, past the temples, past the writing, back to the land that drowned. To understand what Dogland's refugees might have carried with them, we need to get clear on what Dogland actually was. Not a mythical Atlantis, not a fantasy continent people dream up to explain mysteries. A real, documented landscape that existed for thousands of years and then vanished. The modern reconstruction of Dogland begins in a way that feels almost poetic. In the 1930s, fishing trawlers working the Dogger Bank, this shallow ridge in the North Sea, started pulling up things that didn't belong in a net full of fish. Fossilized bones, mammoth tusks, reindeer antlers, and then tools, stone blades, barbed harpoon points, worked bone fragments, shaped in ways nature doesn't shape anything. At first, it's easy to imagine fishermen staring at these objects like, what is this? Because this wasn't shipwreck debris, it wasn't cargo, it wasn't a lost crate from a modern world. It was evidence of land, evidence of a world, Over the following decades, marine geologists and archaeologists began mapping the seafloor in detail. Using sonar, seismic surveys, sediment cores drilled into the ocean floor. And slowly, piece by piece, a ghost landscape started to rise in the data. The North Sea hadn't always been a sea. It had once been dry land, vast, fertile, and alive. Dogland stretched from the coast of Scotland down toward the modern Netherlands, east into Denmark, and north toward Norway. At its peak, it covered an area larger than Britain itself. And here's one of the wildest details. The Thames and the Rhine weren't separate rivers back then. They merged into a massive waterway that ran through the heart of Dogland before draining into the Atlantic far to the west. So picture that for a second. An inland world threaded with rivers, dotted with lakes, rich wetlands, forests. And we know what grew there because pollen grains are basically time capsules. They get trapped in sediment layers and preserved. When scientists pull core samples and analyze them, they can reconstruct vegetation like they're reading a seasonal diary written over thousands of years. Hazel, oak, alder, willow, wetland plants clustering near rivers, open grasslands across interior plains. And the animals? Wild horses, aurochs, deer, reindeer moving along predictable routes, birds thick along marshes, fish running heavy in streams and estuaries when spawning season hit. This wasn't some marginal land where life was constant desperation. This was abundance. And abundance changes everything, because when a landscape is generous, human societies don't just survive, they specialize. They plan, they remember, they develop systems. They form cultural networks because they're not spending every waking moment fighting starvation. And the people of Dogland, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, were far more sophisticated than the old stereotypes suggest. We know, for example, that they built fish traps, engineered structures placed in tidal zones to capture migrating fish efficiently. Not maybe, not could have, but evidence-supported reconstructions based on recovered materials and analogs from similar Mesolithic coastal cultures. They tracked reindeer herds across plains and timed their movements to intercept animals at crossings. They harvested shellfish along coasts. They hunted waterfowl during nesting season. They gathered hazelnuts in the autumn when forests offered the richest yield. And they gathered together. This part matters because it hints at something deeper than small bands wandering around. Evidence suggests that certain sites were used repeatedly, season after season, generation after generation. Communal meeting points where groups came together in large numbers. Not permanent villages in the later Neolithic sense, but social hubs, places where tools were traded, partnerships formed, knowledge shared, stories passed down, maybe rituals performed. When the same location shows signs of repeated use over long time spans, it suggests cultural memory, continuity, a sense of this place matters. And that kind of continuity is one of the building blocks of complexity. Population estimates vary, but conservative models suggest tens of thousands of people lived across Dogland. Some researchers argue it could have been higher, depending on how dense settlement actually was in the richest zones. Either way, one thing is clear. This was not a sparse scattering of isolated families. It was a world, a web of interconnected communities who knew the land, knew each other, and had refined ways of life over thousands of years. But the ice was melting. At the end of the last ice age, glaciers covering Scandinavia and northern Britain began retreating. Meltwater poured into the oceans. Sea levels rose, steadily, relentlessly, year after year, generation after generation. Coastlines shifted inward. River valleys flooded. The western edges of Dogland were slowly swallowed. And the people adapted the way humans always do when the change is slow enough to be survivable. They moved inland. They adjusted routes. They shifted seasonal patterns. They managed the encroachment of water for a long time. Thousands of years. Actually, the land shrank, but it remained until it didn't. Around 6,200 BC, the world did something sudden. Off the coast of Norway, beneath the cold North Atlantic, part of the continental shelf collapsed. The Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater landslides in known history. Try to picture the scale. An estimated 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment breaking loose and thundering into deeper ocean. That displaced water had to go somewhere, so it went everywhere. A tsunami radiated outward, racing across the sea. And when it hit the shallower waters around Dogland, the waves slowed, but grew taller. In some places, possibly up to 20 meters high, maybe higher. And here's the part that's easy to say and hard to feel. There would have been no warning, no time to gather supplies, no time to walk children to safety, no time to prepare. The wave came fast. Entire valleys flooded in minutes. Coastal plains vanished under churning water. Rivers reversed direction, surging inland with violent force. A world that had been home for thousands of years, gone in a day. The psychological horror of that moment is almost impossible to truly imagine. But here's the critical detail. The people did not vanish. Dogland material culture doesn't simply stop as if everyone died. Instead, what we see is dispersal. Technological traditions showing up elsewhere, like fingerprints smeared across a wider map. The genetic signature doesn't disappear. It spreads. Survivors fled. They had to. Some would have gone north into higher ground in what is now Norway. Some east into Denmark and beyond. Some likely moved along the Baltic corridor. And some, maybe driven by necessity, maybe following rivers like natural highways, maybe just moving away from the sea that betrayed them, went south, far south. Now here's the thing about mass displacement. When tens of thousands of people lose their homeland, they don't march as one organized column toward a single destination. They scatter. They splinter. They travel in waves. They stop, settle, move again when resources thin or conflict grows or the land can't support them. Migration is rarely a straight line. People follow terrain that lets them survive. Rivers, forests, coastlines, valleys. They seek familiar ecosystems, or at least ecosystems with predictable resources. And for Dogland survivors, one route makes more sense than the others. The North Sea itself became a graveyard. The Atlantic coast offered no easy refuge. But east and south, through what is now Denmark and into the Baltic corridor, there were pathways leading into major river systems that connected deep into Eurasia. And along those pathways, the evidence begins to whisper. The same technological signatures associated with Dogland's Mesolithic culture begin appearing along the Baltic coast shortly after 6,200 BC. Then they show up further south in regions around the Black Sea. And then, faint but unmistakable traces begin appearing in Levant and northern Mesopotamia. The clearest markers are the tools. Dogland's people were masters of microlith technology, small, precisely shaped stone blades that could be hafted into composite tools. These weren't crude, sharp rock implements. Microliths require advanced knapping techniques, understanding stone fracture mechanics, producing standardized forms that can be replicated reliably. It's not random. It's skill. It's tradition. Microliths were a hallmark of northern European hunter-gatherers, refined over thousands of years into one of the most efficient tool systems in the Mesolithic world. And after the Storiga slide, these distinctive blade industries begin appearing in places they shouldn't. In Denmark, archaeologists find sites dating to the centuries immediately after the tsunami, tool assemblages nearly identical to those associated with submerged Dogland zones. Same narrow blade cores, same geometric microliths. Further south, researchers document intrusive toolkits that appear suddenly without local developmental sequences. Harpoon points designed for deep water fishing show up in coastal sites where they don't quite fit. Specialized scrapers used for processing marine resources appear inland, far from the ocean, and then in the Near East, at Levantine sites dating to the 7th and 6th millennium BC. Excavators find blades that don't match local traditions. They're thinner, more finely worked. They show flaking patterns characteristic of northern techniques. Some show evidence of composite hafting, multiple blades set into wood or bone handles. That's a very specific approach. And specificity matters, because independent invention usually produces similar outcomes in broad terms, but not identical fingerprints in technique. When you're seeing the same patterns of core prep, standardized blade forms, composite hafting traditions, you're not just seeing humans being humans. You're seeing lineage. Someone carried this southward. Someone who learned these methods in the forests and wetlands of a world that no longer existed. But tools are only part of the story, because when catastrophe displaces a population, it doesn't just scatter people, it reshapes culture. It accelerates transmission. It concentrates knowledge among survivors. Anthropologists sometimes talk about a kind of refugee bottleneck effect. Survival pressure forces innovation, while communities become more deliberate about preserving what matters. In stable times, cultures change slowly. Traditions persist because they work. But when the landscape itself is destroyed, the old ways don't work anymore, and adaptation becomes survival. Doglands refugees would have faced that pressure immediately. Fishing grounds gone, hunting routes underwater, gathering sites erased, familiar landscapes replaced by uncertainty, and yet they carried something irreplaceable: memory. Not just memories of places, but memories of how to organize, how to coordinate large gatherings, how to share resources, how to plan seasonally, how to read landscapes, how to find water, identify productive soil, track animal movement, and maybe most importantly, they carried the knowledge that water can't be trusted. That sounds simple, but it's huge. A population that has watched the ocean erase everything doesn't settle casually on vulnerable coasts. They move inland. They seek high ground. They build away from water. Or they develop ways to control it. And when you look at where displaced populations seem to settle along the migration corridor, Baltic interiors, Balkan uplands, river valleys, it starts to feel like more than coincidence. These aren't coastal, let's rebuild by the sea sites. These are inland decisions. Places where rivers can be managed rather than feared. Places where elevation offers safety from what might come again. And in those river valleys, the archaeological record begins to show something else. Early techniques of water management appearing in ways that feel ahead of schedule. Small-scale channels. Stone-lined wells dug deeper and more systematically. Seasonal flood prediction embedded into planning, not random developments. Innovations from people who understand water as both resource and threat. People who learned at catastrophic cost that survival depends on controlling what once controlled them. This migration, Dogland to Mesopotamia, wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have taken centuries, maybe a full millennium. But each generation carries forward what the last one learned, refining it, adapting it, passing it down. So by the time descendants of these refugees reached the marshlands of southern Iraq, they weren't just hunter-gatherers running from a drowned coast. They were survivors who had spent generations learning how to rebuild. But now we had a problem. How do you trace the footsteps of people who left so little behind? Tools can be lost. Campsites vanish. Pottery shatters. Settlements get built over. But there's one record that doesn't vanish so easily. Genes. Every human body carries a history. Ancient journeys, bottlenecks, intermixing, survival. And in the last couple of decades, ancient DNA has opened a window into the past that no amount of broken pottery ever could. And what that window reveals about Europe and the Near East is where the story gets really, really strange. Because once we follow the genetic trail, we're not dealing with maybe. We're dealing with footprints in blood. And that's where we're going next. So let's talk about the thing archaeology can't fake. Artifacts can be moved. Styles can be copied. Tool forms can spread through trade or imitation or parallel invention. But genes? Genes don't spread through rumor. They spread through people. And for a long time, archaeologists didn't have access to that layer of history. They were reconstructing the past from fragments, stone, bone, clay, trying to build full stories from what survived. But over the last couple of decades, ancient DNA changed the game. Not in a vague, oh, that's interesting way. In a we can track who mixed with whom, and roughly when kind of way. The basic idea is simple. Researchers extract DNA from ancient skeletal remains, usually from teeth or the petrous bone in the skull, because those preserve genetic material best. Then sequence a genome and compare it to other ancient genomes. When populations share specific markers, it suggests shared ancestry. When markers show up where they shouldn't, it suggests movement. And when the timing clusters around a specific window, it suggests something happened. Here's where it gets important. For a long time, the expectation was pretty straightforward. Early Near Eastern farmers, the people who first cultivated wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, would show strong genetic continuity with earlier Near Eastern hunter-gatherers. A mostly local story with some regional mixing, but nothing too dramatic. But when the data came in, researchers found puzzles embedded in the genomes. One of the biggest, traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, often shortened to WHG. WHG refers to Mesolithic European populations, people who lived across Europe after the last ice age, before farming fully spread. Forest hunters, river fishers, coastal gatherers. Populations that include the kind of people who would have lived in and around Dogland. And WHG has a distinctive genetic profile. It's not the same as later Neolithic farmers from Anatolia. It's not the same as older Paleolithic groups. It's its own signature. So when WHG markers show up in early Near Eastern populations, the question becomes unavoidable. How did that get there? Now, could you argue that all humans share ancestry if you go far enough back? Sure, but that's not what this is. This isn't deep shared ancestry from 40,000 years ago. This is detectable Mesolithic European ancestry appearing in Near Eastern genomes in ways that imply relatively recent mixing for that time period. And what makes it even stranger is the timing. The WHG admixture in Near Eastern populations doesn't show up as a smooth, gradual increase over millennia. It clusters. It appears suddenly, concentrated in individuals dating to the 7th and 6th millennia BC, right in the centuries after 6,200 BC, right in the window when Dogland was collapsing. Population geneticists have a term for patterns like this, a founder effect. That's when a relatively small group migrates into a region and contributes disproportionately to the gene pool, especially if the receiving population is unstable, stressed, or shrinking. And that detail matters because the 6,200 BC moment wasn't just a Dogland disaster. It was also a climate disruption on a much larger scale. Paleoclimatologists have documented what's often called the 8.2 kiloyear event. This abrupt cooling episode triggered when huge amounts of fresh water entered the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean circulation. The result wasn't just a chilly decade. It lasted more than a century in some reconstructions. Growing seasons shortened. Rain patterns shifted. In parts of the Near East, drought conditions intensified. Crops struggled. Some communities contracted or relocated. So now imagine scenario. The Near East is dealing with climatic instability, food stress, population shifts. At the same time, a whole population in Northern Europe loses its homeland violently and is forced into migration. If even small groups of those refugees move south and integrate into stressed local populations, their genetic signature could spread quickly. That's not a fantasy explanation. That's exactly how founder effects work in the real world. And the DNA hints that something like that may have happened. But the genetic evidence doesn't stop at WHG showed up. It gets weirder. Because when geneticists model ancient populations, sometimes they detect ancestry components that don't match any known group in the dataset. Signals that don't fit into the clean categories. These are often called ghost populations. They're ghosts because they left genetic traces in later people, but we don't have their DNA directly, either because we haven't sampled it yet, or because the physical remains are missing, destroyed, or undiscovered. In studies of early Mesopotamian-adjacent populations, multiple ghost signals have been proposed, and some of those signals show affinities with European hunter-gatherers, meaning, not only do we see European ancestry where we don't expect it, we also see hints of an unsampled population that may have been involved in the mixing, an intermediate group that moved, blended, and left behind traces without leaving behind a clean archaeological label. Now here's a question people don't ask enough. Why does any of this matter beyond who slept with who? Because genes are not just ancestry markers. They are survival tools. Populations evolve adaptations based on their environments. Mesolithic Europeans in cold, variable climates with seasonal scarcity developed metabolic patterns and immune responses shaped by those conditions. Different fat processing, different stress responses, different tolerances for boom and bust resource cycles. Near Eastern populations, living in different ecological conditions, would have different adaptive pressures. So when you see European genetic material mixing into Near Eastern genomes during a period of climate instability, it raises a deeper possibility. Those genes may have carried adaptive advantages in a stressful world, not because Europeans were better, because evolution is practical, not moral. If your ancestors survived unstable seasons, long winters, and unpredictable resource availability, your body might carry traits that help in periods of drought, cold snaps, or food stress. And during the 7th millennium BC, when the climate was wobbling, those traits could matter. Now, none of this proves Dogland refugees built Sumer. We have to keep the logic honest. But it does strongly suggest that people with European hunter-gatherer ancestry reached the Near East in a way that's hard to explain with older, tidy models. And there's another layer the genetic record can reveal, the journey itself. Because migration isn't just movement, it's movement with pauses. When small groups travel, settle briefly, intermix with locals, then move again, their genetic signal changes in a predictable way. Drift, dilution, local admixture, repeated bottlenecks. When researchers track the WHG signal through regions like Denmark, the Baltic Corridor, into the Black Sea Zone, and then toward the Near East, the pattern starts to look like stepping stones. Small groups moving, mixing, continuing. Not an invasion. Not a single caravan crossing continents. A diffusion. A slow thread running through generations. By the time descendants of those migrants reach Mesopotamia, the European signature could be smaller, but still detectable. And that's what we see. Not a full replacement, not a European takeover, but traces. Ghost fingerprints in the genome. Now we hit the most important question of all. Genes tell us people moved, but genes don't tell us what they carried. Did they bring technologies? Organizational systems? Specialized knowledge? Stories? Because that's where this whole remembered cities idea lives or dies. So we go back to the ground. Back to tools, bone, clay, and the physical fingerprints of culture. And here's the thing. Technology does not usually teleport. It develops locally, shaped by materials, pressures, and generations of refinement. A tool tradition perfected in northern wetlands should stay in northern wetlands. It should evolve there, diversify there, eventually be replaced there. It shouldn't show up suddenly, fully formed, thousands of miles away in the river valleys of the Near East. And yet, after 6,200 BC, we start seeing exactly that kind of anomaly. Let's start with microliths again, but more specifically, in the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coastline that forms the western edge of the Fertile Crescent. Archaeologists working in layers dated to the 7th millennium BC find blades that don't quite belong. They're narrower than local traditions, more geometric in form, produced using core preparation methods that don't match the regional norm. Some show clear evidence of composite hafting. Tiny notches, where patterns suggesting they were set into handles alongside other blades. Multiple cutting edges working in parallel. That's not a casual innovation. That's a whole tool philosophy. The same kind of hybrid anomaly shows up further east, in early Mesopotamian sites that predate the rise of Sumer. Toolkits that mix local flint traditions with intrusive forms. Scrapers that look like they were designed for processing hides the way cold climate peoples would. Burins, engraving tools, shaped in ways more common in Baltic contexts. Projectile point styles that hint at techniques outside the local developmental sequence. Typological analysis, basically the forensic comparison of tool forms across regions, matters here. When researchers compare dimensions, flaking angles, use-wear patterns, and production methods, the matches aren't vague. They can be precise enough to say, this isn't just similar, this is the same tradition. And when the same tradition shows up along a corridor that lines up with plausible migration route, the interpretation starts to shift. But stone tools aren't the strangest part. Pottery is, because ceramic traditions are famously conservative. They're passed down inside communities like recipes, like dialects, how you temper clay, how you fire it, what patterns you decorate with. These become cultural signatures. Yet in the 7th millennium BC, Pottery begins appearing in parts of Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia with decorative motifs that don't have clear local precedent. Wave patterns in size into rims. Geometric impressions made with shell edges. Linear designs applied with comb-like tools. And these motifs are strong echoes in Atlantic European ceramic traditions. Coastal cultures stretching from Iberia up toward the North Sea. In some cases, you see hybrids, vessel shapes that feel local, decorated with motifs that feel foreign. That's exactly what you'd expect of displaced people integrated into existing communities. They adapt to new materials and local styles, but they keep pieces of their own symbolic vocabulary, the patterns they learned as children, the motifs that carry meaning beyond function. The same is true for bone and antler work. Mesolithic Northern Europeans carved symbolic marks into tools and ornaments. Parallel lines, cross-hatching chevrons, abstract geometric forms. Not random doodles. Repeated patterns that suggest shared symbolism. And then, after 6,200 BC, similar motifs begin appearing on bone artifacts in parts of the Near East. Harpoon points etched with grooves, awls marked with cross-hatching, ornaments strung in arrangements that feel familiar if you've seen northern assemblages. Now, symbols are harder to transmit than tools. If you trade with someone, they might take your blade. They're less likely to adopt your symbolic language wholesale, unless you're living together. So when symbolic systems appear across vast distances in tight time windows, it leans toward migration. People carrying identity, not just goods. And this is where institutional archaeology gets stuck. Traditional models often assume Near Eastern civilization developed mostly through local evolution, villages gradually becoming towns, towns becoming cities. And when anomalies appear, foreign-looking tools, strange pottery motifs, they get explained away as trade, misdating, or convergent invention. Sometimes that's reasonable, but when the anomalies cluster, when they show up in the same centuries, along the same corridor, after the same catastrophe, it becomes harder to dismiss them as random, because what we're seeing doesn't look like trade goods sitting on a shelf. It looks like daily life. Tools worn from use. Pottery made locally with foreign techniques. Symbols integrated into community practice. That's the signature of resident populations. And if the displacement of Dogland sent waves of refugees moving south, it would create exactly this kind of scattered but consistent cultural imprint. Still, even with tools, pottery, and genes, there's a gap, a big one, between Dogland drowning around 6,200 BC and the rise of the first true cities in Sumer around the 4th millennium BC. There are centuries, actually millennia, of adaptation, blending, transmission. That kind of time can blur evidence. So the question becomes, what happens when we finally arrive at Sumer? Because when Sumer appears, it doesn't feel like a slow climb. It feels like someone switched the lights on. And that's what we're stepping into next. So now we arrive at the moment where everything gets unsettling. Because for nearly 2,000 years after Dogland's destruction, we can imagine waves of displaced people moving, mixing, adapting, leaving scattered fingerprints in tools, pottery, genes, and story. That part is messy, human, believable. But then something happens that feels almost too clean. Suddenly, Sumer appears. And the standard narrative you hear is comforting. Early farming villages slowly grew. People learned to cooperate, systems evolved, and one day, after a lot of trial and error, cities emerged. A gradual climb from simple to complex. The problem is, Sumer doesn't look like a gradual climb. It looks like a leap. Around 4,300 BC in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, urban centers begin to take shape. By 3,500 BC, less than a millennium later, Uruk has become a true city. Some estimates put it at around 40,000 people, surrounded by smaller settlements, tied together by irrigation networks, managed by bureaucracies and recorded in writing. Archaeologists call this the Uruk expansion, when Sumerian culture spreads outward with speed that doesn't sit comfortably inside the old slow growth model. But the mystery isn't just speed. It's the feeling that the systems show up, already working. Start with the cities themselves. When excavators first dug into the earliest levels of Eridu, considered by later Sumerians to be their oldest city, they expected humble beginnings. You know rough layouts, small structures, early experiments, the awkward phase of people learning how to live packed together. But what they found looked like sophistication from the start. Even in its earliest phases, Eridus shows planning. Buildings aren't just scattered randomly. They're oriented along deliberate axes. There's separation between public and residential space. And the temple platform, the architectural form that will later evolve into massive ziggurats, appears not as a late development, but as a founding feature. That's a big deal, because it suggests religious and civic organization weren't added later. They were baked into the city's conception. At Uruk, the pattern becomes even harder to ignore. Uruk emerges with monumental architecture already in place. The White Temple, built around 3200 BC, sits on a platform roughly 40 feet high. The Iana district shows large-scale craft production, centralized storage, and administrative buildings. All of that implies something most people don't think about. It implies management. You don't get centralized storage without people tracking what goes in and out. You don't get large craft districts without supply chains. You don't get monumental platforms without mobilizing huge labor forces and feeding them while they work. This isn't what early fumbling looks like. This is what implementation looks like. And then there's the water. Southern Mesopotamia is not naturally a paradise for farming. Rainfall is sparse and unreliable. The Tigris and Euphrates flood unpredictably, and often at the wrong times for planting. Summer heat is brutal. Without irrigation, large-scale agriculture is basically impossible. And without large-scale agriculture, cities can't survive. So if Sumer is going to exist at all, it has to solve water. And the Sumerians solved it with irrigation systems that appear strangely mature. Not just small ditches. Not let's experiment with a channel and see what happens. Sumerian irrigation is hydraulic engineering. Canals running for miles, feeding multiple settlements. Levees controlling seasonal flooding. Drainage systems preventing salt buildup. Basin irrigation requiring precise timing. Knowledge of flow, soil absorption, and water distribution. And it requires something else even more important. Coordination. Workers to dig and maintain channels. Administrators to track distribution. Rules to manage conflict between communities competing for water. Scheduling. Labor organization. Enforcement. And here's the puzzle. This appears functioning early. Archaeologists have looked for simpler prototypes. Small experimental canals in pre-Sumerian villages. Evidence of trial and error irrigation in earlier phases. Some small-scale management existed, sure, but the leap to systematize regional irrigation still feels abrupt in the record. So how do you learn to manage water at that scale without centuries of visible failure? One answer is uncomfortable, but simple. You already knew. And then we hit administration. Complex societies don't run on vibes. They run on records, tracking goods, labor, debts, obligations. Sumer is famous for developing writing to meet those needs. The earliest clay tablets with proto-cuneiform appear around 3200 BC. But here's what's strange. Writing doesn't emerge as crude marks slowly refined over endless generations. It shows up already capable of recording complex economic transactions. The earliest tablets from Uruk document grain stores, livestock inventories, labor assignments, and distributions using sophisticated numerical notation and standardized signs. There are consistent formatting conventions. Scribes follow structured patterns. Again, this doesn't feel like invention in its baby phase. It feels like usage. Now, to be fair, archaeologists do point to precursors. Clay tokens used for counting and accounting, for example. Those existed earlier. But the gap between token-based counting and a full writing system is enormous. That's the difference between tallying sheep and managing contracts. Sumer appears to make that leap in what looks archaeologically like a single bound. Then there's astronomy. Early Sumerian texts and later Mesopotamian traditions preserve sophisticated mathematical systems for tracking celestial cycles. They calculate lunar months. They track planetary movement. They operate in a base 60 system, sexagesimal, that still shapes how we measure time in angles. And that kind of astronomical knowledge doesn't appear overnight. You don't predict celestial cycles without watching the sky systematically, across generations, recording patterns, correcting errors, building models. Even the simplest long-term prediction requires specialist data and time. Yet Sumerian astronomy appears to start at an advanced level, with frameworks already in place. So when you step back, you see the same pattern repeating. Cities that look planned, irrigation that looks engineered, writing that looks mature, astronomy that looks accumulated. And the standard response has often been, maybe the earlier stages existed, but we haven't found them. And that's possible. The archaeological record is incomplete. Sites are buried. Early layers can be destroyed by later construction. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But when the gaps stack up in the same direction, when every major system seems to appear without a clear learning curve, it starts to feel like more than missing data. It starts to feel like a knowledge base arrived. Not a single secret blueprint. Not some magical lost technology. But lived experience, organizational habits, water management instincts, methods of coordination, carried by people who were not learning from scratch. If Sumer's founders included descendants of displaced populations who had spent millennia adapting, migrating, rebuilding, then the sudden sophistication makes more sense. Because those wouldn't be people inventing civilization for the first time. Those would be people rebuilding it, using inherited frameworks refined by necessity. The irrigation begins to look like the work of people who don't see water as a friendly resource, but as a force that once erased their world. The urban planning begins to look like the work of communities already practiced in coordinating large gatherings, seasonal, communal organizations scaled up into permanence. The astronomy begins to look like knowledge gathered across lifetimes of movement, where sky watching wasn't hobby but survival. And the writing starts to look like something deeper than accounting. It starts to look like fear. Not panic fear in the moment, cultural fear. The knowledge that memory can drown, that oral tradition can fracture, that if you don't preserve what you know, the world can take it from you. Which brings us to the Sumerians' own stories. Because even if the ground and the genes whisper, the myths sometimes speak aloud. And the oldest story they kept returning to was about a flood. Every culture tells stories about the past. Most of them get filed away as allegory, moral instruction wrapped in dramatic imagery. Gods, monsters, heroes, punishment, rebirth. The kind of stories people use to explain life when the world feels too big to understand. But sometimes inside a myth, there are details that feel too specific. Not just there was a flood, because floods happen everywhere. I mean details that point to a particular kind of flood, a particular kind of survival, a particular kind of people. And that's why the Sumerian flood story matters so much here. The earliest written versions show up in different forms. Ziusudra in older Sumerian tradition, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, later echoes in other Mesopotamian texts. Different names, different emphasis, but the same skeleton of a story. A man is warned, catastrophe is coming. He builds a great boat. He seals it with pitch. He loads it not only with family and animals, but with craftsmen, specialists, people with skills. The flood arrives. And it's not gentle. It's overwhelming, sudden, violent. Waters rise until they cover everything. The story says the world is obliterated. Then, when the waters recede, he sends out birds to find land. A dove returns. A swallow returns. A raven doesn't. The boat comes to rest on a mountain. The survivors disembark, offer sacrifices. And from that remnant, the world begins again. Most people read that as cosmic mythology, a narrative about divine judgment and renewal. But read it again with Dogland in mind, and a different set of details jumps out. First, the flood isn't described like the regular seasonal flooding of Mesopotamian rivers. Mesopotamia floods, yes, but typically in predictable cycles driven by snowmelt. It's the kind of flood where you move to slightly higher ground, wait out, return. The Sumerian story doesn't feel like that. It feels like a world-ending wall of water. Sudden, crushing, total, and second, the escape happens by boat. That's a big clue. Because if the primary danger is a rising river in a floodplain, you don't usually solve that by putting everyone in a boat and drifting until a mountain appears. You solve it by moving upslope, You move inland. You wait. But if you're a coastal people hit by something like a mega tsunami, something that arrives fast, floods everything low, tears through valleys, reverses rivers, then boat technology becomes a difference between death and survival. For a marine-adapted population, a boat isn't just transportation. It's a life raft. And Doglands people, living amid rivers, estuaries, wetlands, and coastal zones, would have been boat people. They'd have known water. They'd have built vessels. They'd have used them daily. Third, and this is a detail that feels almost like someone underlined it, the story emphasizes preserving knowledge. Utnapishtim doesn't just save bodies. He saves craftsmen. Why mention that? Why highlight specialists? Because in a refugee catastrophe, skills are treasure. A community can lose land, homes, stored food, sacred places, everything, and still survive if it preserves the people who know how to rebuild. A boat full of craftsmen is a cultural arc. It's a statement that survival isn't just physical, it's civilizational. Now, here's the part that gets tricky, and I want to be careful. Flood myths exist worldwide. They're almost universal because water is universal. Humans live near rivers and coasts. Flooding is a common threat. So the mere existence of a flood story doesn't prove anything by itself. But specificity changes the conversation. When flood myths share distinct narrative structures and unusual details, boat construction, sealing with pitch, preserving craftsmen, releasing birds in sequence, it becomes harder to argue we're looking at entirely independent inventions, especially when similar elements appear in traditions far from Mesopotamia. Because Northern Europe has its own drowned land myths. They're not as globally famous, but they're there. Stories of fertile plains swallowed by the sea, of cities lost underwater, of coastal breaches that wiped out worlds. Welsh tradition remembers Canar Gwylod, a lowland realm drowned when the sea broke through defenses. Breton legends speak of Wyas, a wealthy city lost to flooding. Celtic stories whisper about sunken kingdoms and vanished coastlines. These often get dismissed as coastal peoples doing what coastal peoples always do, telling cautionary tales about storms and tides. But some of these stories are weirdly precise in geography. They point toward submerged zones in and around where Dogland once existed. They describe fertile plains, abundance, and sudden loss. And when you stack that next to the actual physical fact that a thriving lowland world did drown in that region, the myths start to look less like fantasy and more like memory. Anthropologists have a term for this: mythic encoding. Traumatic historical events, especially those that threaten group survival, often get preserved as emotionally charged narratives. Over generations, details shift, supernatural elements appear, gods get added, but the core shape of the event can remain stable. Not because people are trying to preserve history like a textbook, but because trauma carves grooves into culture, and those grooves guide what gets repeated. So now imagine a displaced population moving south over generations. They carry tools, yes. They carry genes, yes. But they also carry stories. The story of the day the sea came, the day the land died, the day only a boat and the knowledge aboard made survival possible. Then they arrive in the Near East during a time when the climate itself is unstable. Cold snaps, drought, shifting rainfall. Local communities are already anxious, already searching for meaning in disaster. And these newcomers bring a story that explains catastrophe. Not just we had a bad season, but the world can end. Shared trauma creates cultural bonding. When two populations experience instability and fear at the same time, their narratives can merge quickly. Over generations, the distinction between their flood story and our flood story disappears. A shared myth forms. And suddenly, a memory born on the coast of a drowned northern world becomes a foundational story in the cradle of civilization. That's the power of myth. It travels where artifacts can't. It survives where architecture doesn't. It hides truth in plain sight. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but if this connection is real, if displaced populations from a drowned northern world really influence Mesopotamia, why don't we see clearer proof? Why isn't it obvious? Why isn't there a neat, continuous trail we can follow like breadcrumbs? And that question is actually the doorway into the next part of the story. Because the reason it's hard to see isn't necessarily because it's wrong. Sometimes it's hard to see because of how evidence disappears. Dogland itself is underwater. Migration leaves faint traces. Early Mesopotamian layers are buried under thousands of years of later construction, and academic disciplines often don't talk to each other in the ways they need to for this pattern to become obvious. What we're dealing with is not a lack of evidence. It's fragmented evidence. Evidence scattered across geology, genetics, archaeology, mythology, climate science. 5 different conversations happening in 5 different rooms. And the only way to hear the whole story is to walk between the rooms and assemble the fragments yourself. So that's what we're doing next. We're going to look at the archaeology of disappearance. Why a connection like this could be real and still remain hidden in plain sight. If there's one thing archaeology teaches you, if you really sit with it, it's that history isn't something we find whole. It's something we reconstruct. From fragments, from accidents, from whatever time, water, and human activity didn't manage to erase. And that's exactly why a connection like Dogland, Mesopotamia can feel invisible even if it's real. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the kind of event we're talking about is the kind that naturally shreds evidence into scattered pieces. So let's walk through why the trail is so faint. Start with the most obvious problem. Dogland itself is underwater. The landscape that once supported tens of thousands of people now lies beneath roughly 50 feet of seawater, buried under additional meters of sediment that accumulated over 8,000 years. And the North Sea is not a gentle archive. Currents scour the seabed. Storms shift sediment. Trawling nets drag across ancient surfaces. Even if a site is preserved, it's not sitting there waiting politely for a clean excavation, the way a buried village might be on land. Most of what we have from Dogland comes from accidental discoveries. Artifacts pulled up in fishing nets, bones exposed by erosion, occasional targeted surveys. We can map the ancient rivers. We can reconstruct the vegetation. We can identify where likely settlements would have been. But we can't do what archaeologists love to do, excavate systematically. We can't walk a grid and uncover hearths, dwelling patterns, storage pits, burial sites, craft areas. And that matters because context is everything. A single tool in a net tells you humans were here. A full excavated site tells you how they lived, how they organized, how they structured society. So right away, we're trying to trace the influence of a culture whose main archaeological record is largely inaccessible. That alone would make any long-distance connection hard to prove. Then comes problem number 2. Migration is archaeologically messy. When populations move, they don't carry their entire material culture with them. They travel light. They prioritize portable tools, essential supplies, and knowledge. They abandon what breaks. They build temporary camps that leave minimal traces. They may pass through landscapes quickly, leaving behind only scattered fragments. And when they do settle, something else happens. They blend. They adopt local materials. They adjust techniques. They intermarry. They exchange practices. So instead of a clean, this is Dogland culture, signature stamped on the Near East, what you get is a hybrid. A ceramic vessel shaped locally but decorated with foreign motifs. A toolkit that mixes local flint methods with intrusive blade styles. A symbolic mark appearing on an object that otherwise looks regionally normal. That's how integration looks in real life. But it's also how evidence becomes easy to misread. Because if you're an archaeologist excavating a Levantine site and you find one unusual microlitite in a mixed assemblage, the simplest explanation is trade, influence, coincidence. If you're not specifically looking for long-distance displacement, you don't jump straight to refugees from a drowned northern world arrived here. You file it as an anomaly. And that brings us to problem number 3. The migration route itself runs through hard-to-read landscapes. Think about the Baltic Corridor, the Black Sea region, the Balkans. These areas have been heavily disturbed by later settlement, agriculture, and construction. Some coastlines shifted. Some lowlands flooded. Entire zones changed dramatically in the same period of post-Ice Age sea level rise. Even if Dogland refugees moved through these regions, their temporary camps and early settlements could be buried, destroyed, or misidentified. Now add problem number 4. Mesopotamia is one of the most continuously occupied regions on Earth. The great Sumerian cities weren't abandoned and left alone like a forgotten ruin. They were occupied, rebuilt, expanded, conquered, rebuilt again, layer after layer after layer. That creates tells, artificial hills made of compacted architectural debris. It's incredible for archaeology because you get long histories in one place. But it's also a nightmare because the earliest layers, the layers where the crucial transitional evidence would be, are buried deep under thousands of years of later material. To reach the earliest phases, you often have to remove later ones. That's expensive, slow, and sometimes impossible. And early excavations, especially in the 19th and early 20th century, didn't always use modern stratigraphic methods. Layers got mixed, context got lost. Some artifacts were pulled out without careful recording. Add in modern damage, looting, construction, erosion, conflict, and you get another brutal truth. Some evidence has been destroyed faster than it can be studied, which means the period that would matter most here, the Ubaid period, the culture just before the Uruk explosion, is among the least accessible and most fragmentary. Now here's the key point. Even within these constraints, anomalies exist. Archaeologists have documented tool types in Ubaid layers that don't fit local sequences. Pottery showing unexpected stylistic elements. Architectural features with no clear antecedents. Storage systems and organizational patterns that raise questions. The evidence is there, but it's scattered, published in specialized journals, filed away as curiosities, not connected into a single narrative because a narrative will require synthesis across disciplines that rarely meet. And that brings us to problem number 5, institutional silos. Near Eastern archaeology developed as its own world, its own traditions, chronologies, theories. European Mesolithic studies developed separately. A specialist in Sumerian urbanism doesn't usually spend their career reading the literature on dogland. A dogland researcher doesn't usually dive deep into Mesopotamian irrigation studies. So even when the evidence hints at connection, it's often sitting in separate rooms, separate conferences, separate journals, separate departments. No one is hiding anything. They're just not assembling the pieces because the structure of the field doesn't reward cross-continental synthesis. And then there's problem number 6, which is more psychological than practical. Archaeology's complicated relationship with migration theories. For much of the 20th century, migration was invoked way too casually to explain cultural change, often in ways tied to nationalist or colonial narratives. These people must have come in and improved things. That kind of thinking did real harm, so the field corrected. It shifted toward emphasizing local development, indigenous innovation, continuity. That correction was needed, but it also created a new bias, a reluctance to propose long-distance migration, even when evidence supports it, because suggesting that displaced European populations contributed to Sumer can sound like old diffusionist theories. Even if that's not what you mean, it can trigger fears of diminishing Mesopotamian achievements. It can feel politically or culturally charged. So scholars who notice anomalies often frame them cautiously, or avoid broad interpretations entirely. Again, not a conspiracy, a social pressure, a professional pressure, a fear of being misunderstood. So when you step back, you see a perfect storm of invisibility. Dogland's main sites are underwater and hard to excavate. Migration leaves faint, messy traces. The route passes through disturbed and changing landscapes. Early Mesopotamian layers are buried under millennia of rebuilding. Evidence gets misidentified as trade or coincidence. Academic disciplines don't easily cross-pollinate. Theoretical caution discourages bold migration narratives. That's how a real pattern can hide. Not because it's impossible, but because it's fragmented by nature. Now, here's the turning point. Even with all that fragmentation, there are moments when separate lines of evidence, developed independently, without trying to prove anything, suddenly converge. When geology lines up with genetics, when material culture aligns with myth, when population models match climatic disruption, when the dates sync with an almost uncomfortable precision. And that's what happens here. Because once you place a timeline side by side, without cherry picking, without forcing the fit, the intersections start to look less like coincidence and more like a coherent sequence. And that sequence has a very specific anchor point, 6,200 BC. So next, we're going to take everything we've talked about, Dogland drowning, the Storiga slide, the climate disruption, the genetic signatures, the tool and pottery anomalies, the flood myths, and line them up like a timeline. Because when you do that, the story changes. It stops feeling like scattered mysteries, and it starts feeling like a single event whose echoes shape the world. There are moments in any investigation where you stop looking at individual clues, and you start looking at the shape of the whole thing. Not here's one artifact, not here's one DNA marker, not here's one myth, but the alignment, the way separate lines of evidence, developed by different disciplines, for different reasons, start pointing to the same place. This is one of those moments. Because when you lay the records side by side, the timelines intersect with precision that's hard to shrug off. Let's start with the anchor date, 6,200 BC. This isn't an arbitrary number pulled from a legend or a guess based on vibes. It's a documented event horizon. We see a major climatic disruption around this time, a cooling episode recorded in multiple proxies. Ice cores reflect sudden shifts. Sediment records show changes. Pollen data indicates vegetation disruption. Across the northern hemisphere, something happens that lasts long enough to reshape human life, not just for a season, but for generations. At the same moment, Dogland experiences catastrophe, not the slow, understandable drowning of sea level rise, but violent, sudden destruction. The Storiga slide triggers a mega tsunami. Waves surge across the North Sea. Lowlands flood. Valleys vanish. Settlement zones get erased. And tens of thousands of people who had lived in that landscape for thousands of years, are forced out. Now, if this story ended there, it would still be a tragedy. A lost world. But it doesn't end there. Because right after that same window, we see changes elsewhere. And this is where things get sharp. In the Near East, specifically in the centuries following 6,200 BC, population models and settlement patterns show growth spurts that exceed what local birth rates would easily explain. New villages appear. Existing communities expand. There's a sense of demographic movement. The standard interpretation often focuses on internal shifts, local populations moving away from marginal zones into more productive areas as climate wobbles. That's reasonable. But genetics complicates it. Ancient DNA from early Near Eastern populations shows signals of unusual admixture during the same broad window, particularly traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, WHG, a genetic signature associated with Mesolithic Europe. And again, the important detail isn't just WHG exists somewhere, it's the pattern of timing. It doesn't appear as a slow gradient built over endless millennia. It clusters. It becomes visible in individuals and groups dating to the 7th and 6th millennia BC, right after Dogland destruction. That clustering is what makes it feel like an event, not background noise. Then we look for stepping stones. Because if people move from northwestern Europe toward the Near East, we wouldn't expect a clean, straight line. We'd expect a trail of gradual diffusion. Small groups moving, settling, mixing, moving again. And when researchers trace genetic and cultural signals across intermediary zones, the Baltic region, areas around the Black Sea, you see patterns that resemble that kind of stepping stone movement. Not perfect, not continuous, but consistent enough to be suggestive. Now bring in material culture. After 6,200 BC, we see tool industries, especially microlithic traditions, appearing in regions where they don't have clear local developmental sequences. Not just small blades exist, because small blades exist in many places, but specific production techniques, specific core preparation styles, composite tool philosophies, and alongside tools, we see pottery motifs and symbolic markings that echo Atlantic and Northern European traditions appearing in parts of Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia in the centuries after this window. Again, any one instance could be written off as coincidence. But clustering matters. When multiple categories of cultural fingerprints show up in the same time window, along a corridor that makes geographic sense, it starts looking less random. Now add mythology. The Sumerian flood myth doesn't read like a simple seasonal river story. It reads like sudden catastrophic inundation, survival by boat, preservation of knowledge. Northern European drownland legends tell of fertile plains swallowed by the sea, sudden loss, survivors, places now beneath water. Both ends of the map preserve flood memory. And if mythic encoding preserves traumatic events, then shared narrative structures can reflect shared experience or shared origins. Now, take one more step back. We have geology giving us the event. We have climate proxies giving us the global stress context. We have archaeology hinting at displacement and cultural intrusion. We have genetics showing movement and mixing. We have mythology preserving the emotional memory. 5 independent streams. And they converge around one broad sequence. A northern landscape is destroyed. Survivors disperse in waves. They move through corridors shaped by rivers and land bridges. They integrate with populations already stressed by climate instability. Over time, their descendants appear in the Near East, genetically and culturally. Eventually, in southern Mesopotamia, we see the rise of cities that look less like early fumbling and more like skilled implementation. Now, this is where we have to be responsible. This doesn't mean dogland refugees. Invented? Sumer. That's too simplistic. And honestly, it's not supported by the evidence we have. Sumerian civilization is clearly a synthesis. Local Mesopotamian populations contributed essential agricultural knowledge, environmental adaptation, and cultural traditions. But what this convergence suggests is that local development alone might not explain everything, especially the speed and maturity of certain systems. So now we return to Sumer with fresh eyes. When we see irrigation systems appearing already systematized, when we see urban planning that feels intentional from the beginning, when we see writing showing up already capable of complex accounting, when we see astronomical frameworks that imply long-term observation, those no longer have to be framed as impossible mysteries. They can be framed as the results of integration. Refugee-descended populations bringing organizational habits and water management instincts shaped by catastrophe. Local populations bringing agricultural practice and regional continuity. The fusion creating something unprecedented. And that fusion is why Sumer looks like a leap. Because when you combine 2 streams of knowledge, especially under pressure, you can get acceleration. A stress environment rewards any community that can adapt quickly, any group that can organize labor, manage resources, build resilience. And refugee populations often carry exactly the kind of survival knowledge that turns into innovation when it meets the right conditions. Now, there's another way to test whether this convergence is meaningful. Look not only at what Sumer built, but at how Sumer thought. Because if a civilization is shaped by inherited memory, especially inherited trauma, you would expect to see it not only in canals and temples, but in cultural instincts, in what they obsessively track, in what they ritualize, in what they build monuments around, in what they fear. And that's where this story turns from maybe a migration happened into something more intimate. Because if the first Sumerians included descendants of people who watched their world drown, then the legacy isn't just genetic or technological. It's psychological. It's cultural. It's the kind of imprint that shapes a society's choices for centuries. So next, we're going to look at Sumer through that lens. Not just what did they invent, but what did they need to control? What did they need to preserve? What did they build as if they were trying to keep the world from ending again? Because when you ask that, Sumer starts to look like a civilization built on memory. If you've ever talked to someone who survived something huge, something that rearranged their whole sense of safety, you know what trauma does. It doesn't just leave a story. It leaves instincts. It leaves habits. It leaves a quiet, constant awareness that the world can change without warning. And when trauma is shared by an entire community, when it becomes collective, the imprint can last for generations. Sometimes it becomes ritual. Sometimes it becomes law. Sometimes it becomes architecture. So if Sumer's founders included descendants of Dogland's refugees, then we're not just looking for foreign tools or unexpected genes. We're also looking for something harder to measure, but easier to feel. A civilization that behaves like it remembers an ending. Let's start with the most obvious obsession in Sumerian life: water. Most agricultural societies treat water as a resource. A necessity, sure. Something you manage, respect, plan around. But for people whose ancestral memory includes a day when water didn't just flood fields, it erased an entire world. Water is never just a resource. It's a threat, a force that must be mastered. And Sumer's relationship with water looks less like cautious farming and more like total control. Their irrigation systems weren't minimal interventions. They weren't simple channels scratched into soil. They were regional infrastructures, canals stretching for miles, levees engineered to manage flooding, drainage systems designed to prevent waterlogging and salt buildup, distribution networks feeding multiple settlements, requiring scheduling, administration, enforcement. This isn't the mindset of people who assume nature is stable. This is the mindset of people who assume nature can turn on you. And it's not just the canals. Look at how early Sumerian communities organized themselves around water management. Control of water becomes power. Water rights become conflict points. Administration becomes tied to irrigation, because when survival depends on water being controlled correctly, the group that controls water controls everything. Now consider something that looks boring on the surface, but is psychologically one of the clearest signals of anxiety. Accounting. The earliest Sumerian tablets aren't poems. They're not epic myths. They're not love letters. They're ledgers, grain counts, livestock inventories, labor assignments, tool distributions, resource tracking down the precise quantities. And you can read that as bureaucracy emerging, which is true, but you can also read it as something deeper. A culture that does not trust abundance. A culture that counts because counting feels like safety. Because if your ancestral story includes losing everything, land, homes, stored food, sacred places, then you develop a different relationship with resources. You don't assume tomorrow will be normal. You measure, you record, you plan, you keep track. Not because you're naturally obsessed with numbers, but because you've inherited the knowledge that chaos is always possible. The earliest tablets don't feel casual. They feel meticulous, almost obsessive. And that makes sense if record keeping isn't just administration. It's survival behavior turned into a system. Now look at urbanization. Hunter-gatherer societies often avoid concentrating too many people in one place for long periods. It increases disease risk, strains resources, and makes you vulnerable if something goes wrong locally. Dispersal is resilience. But Sumer chooses concentration. Not just villages, but cities. Dense populations dependent on shared infrastructure. That's a risk. So why take it? One answer is economic. Specialization, trade, administration, efficiency. But there's also a security logic. When people are scattered, they're easier to break apart, harder to defend, harder to coordinate during crisis, more vulnerable to being isolated. But when people are concentrated, they can pool resources, coordinate defense, mobilize labor quickly, support each other. Cities aren't just economic engines. They're survival machines. They're a collective decision that we live together because together is safer. And if you imagine a population descended from refugees, people whose survival depended on cohesion through migration, then urbanization starts to feel less like novelty and more like instinct. Stay together. Build systems that bind people into mutual dependence. Don't risk fragmentation, because fragmentation is how you die. Now, we need to talk about the temples. Ziggurats become the most iconic architecture of Sumer. Massive step platforms rising above the flat land, visible from far away. Labor-intensive, resource-hungry, monumental. The standard explanation is religious. Temples as houses for gods, ziggurats as artificial mountains connecting earth to heaven. And yes, that's absolutely part of it. But consider another layer. If your cultural memory includes a world destroyed by forces beyond human control, floods, storms, climate disruption, then religion isn't just spiritual philosophy, it's risk management. Because if the cosmos can wipe you out, then maintaining the right relationship with cosmic powers becomes survival strategy. Monuments become reassurance. Ritual becomes stability. Temple building becomes a way of saying, we are aligned with the order of the universe. We are doing what must be done. The world will not end again. This is speculative, of course. We can't read ancient minds directly, but we can observe a pattern across human history. Societies that experience profound collective trauma often create elaborate rituals and monumental structures designed to restore a sense of order and prevent recurrence. And Sumer's temples, towering above the floodplains, could be read not only as worship, but as cultural armor. Now let's return to writing, because writing is the most intimate technology a traumatized culture can invent. Writing is memory made physical. Oral tradition is powerful, but it's fragile. It depends on people living long enough to pass knowledge down. It depends on specialists. It depends on stable communities. In a world of displacement, oral memory can break. Stories change. Skills get lost when the last person who knows them dies. Writing solves that. It makes knowledge survive the individual. It preserves information across generations, even if people move, even if communities fragment, even if catastrophe comes again. And the way writing appears in Sumer, mature, structured, capable from the outset, suggests it wasn't born out of curiosity. It was born out of need, a need to preserve, to fix, to make knowledge permanent, so it could never drown again. And then there's astronomy. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian traditions preserve sophisticated sky knowledge, tracking lunar cycles, measuring time, modeling patterns. Again, that kind of expertise requires long-term observation. But for populations who spend generations migrating across continents, navigating by stars, timing seasons by celestial markers, reading the sky to survive, sky knowledge becomes practical tradition, not science in the modern sense. Survival literacy. So when those practices finally get recorded in text, they look advanced because they've been refined for centuries. They're not being invented in Sumer. They're being documented there. Now, when you stack these cultural features together, water mastery, meticulous accounting, urban concentration, monumental temples, writing as permanent memory, sky watching as structured practice, you start to see a coherent psychological profile. A society that behaves as if the world can end quickly. A society that builds as if it's trying to prevent that ending. Control water completely, because water once destroyed everything. Count resources obsessively, because scarcity is always possible. Lie together because isolation is dangerous. Build temples because cosmic order must be maintained. Write because memory must survive. Watch the sky because the sky tells you when danger is coming. And here's the important nuance. This does not mean Sumer was built by Europeans. That's a crude misread. Sumer was a synthesis. Local Mesopotamian populations contributed huge amounts. Agriculture, environmental adaptation, local traditions, innovation. But the refugee contribution, if present, would explain something local development alone struggles to explain. The particular character of Sumerian systems, how quickly they appear functional, and how intensely they focus on control, measurement, and permanence, which leads us to the final, almost haunting implication. If a drowned world beneath the North Sea shaped the first cities of Mesopotamia, then Dogland might not be unique. Because post-Ice Age sea level rise didn't just drown Dogland. It drowned coastlines everywhere. And those coastlines were where people lived. The Persian Gulf was once a fertile valley before it flooded. The Sunda Shelf once connected mainland Southeast Asia to what are now islands. Coasts of India, China, and the Americas all shifted dramatically. Each drowned coastline could have held thriving communities. Some perished. Some fled inland. Some carried knowledge into new regions. And if that happened, if it happened more than once, then civilization isn't a straight line from primitive to advanced. It's a pattern, a cycle, a story written by survivors who refuse to let knowledge die. So now the question becomes, if this pattern is real, why are we taught history this way? Why do our origin stories flatten into a single beginning, as if everything before was darkness? And what does it mean for us, today, living in a world where the sea is rising again? That's where we're going next. Because the story of Dogland and Sumer isn't just about the past. It's about what happens when worlds drown and what survives. There's a reason this story feels like it's tugging at something deeper than archaeology. Because it isn't just about an ancient coastline and some old cities. It's about a pattern we don't like to admit. Human history is built on loss. Civilization doesn't rise in a clean, straight line. It stumbles, breaks, adapts, rebuilds. And sometimes what we call a beginning is actually the restart point after an ending. The reason we aren't usually taught history that way is simple. Clean narratives are easy to sell. A neat timeline, a steady progression. First you hunt, then you farm, then you build cities, then you write, then you become us. It's comforting. It makes the past feel like a staircase. But the world doesn't work like a staircase. It works like weather. And the Holocene, the period we're talking about, was a time of dramatic change. Sea levels rising, coastlines shifting, river systems reorganizing, climate snapping cold, and then warming again, entire ecosystems rearranging. That means people weren't just inventing new ways to live. They were responding to instability. And the Dogland story is powerful because it gives us a case where we can actually watch that instability hit like a hammer, then trace the ripples. But here's the thing. Even if every detail of the Dogland-Sumer connection remains debated, the core principle holds. Drowned worlds existed. Coastal populations were displaced. Those populations didn't vanish into thin air. They moved. And when people move, they don't just bring their bodies. They bring their skills, their instincts, their stories, their ways of organizing life. So even if Dogland isn't the only source of Sumer sudden sophistication, it's a reminder that we may be underestimating how much lost coastlines shaped early human development. Because coastlines are where people cluster. They're resource-rich. Fish, shellfish, trade access, fertile floodplains, navigation routes. In many regions, early dense populations would have been coastal long before they were inland. And when seas rose after the last ice age, those coastal zones didn't politely retire. They drowned, one by one, which means there may be many Doglands, not just in Europe, everywhere. Think about the Persian Gulf. Today it's a shallow sea, but during lower sea levels, it would have been a fertile river valley. If people lived there, and it's extremely likely they did, then that landscape drowned too. Or the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, once a massive lowland connecting the mainland to the islands we now call Indonesia. That was dry land. People lived there. Forests, rivers, hunting grounds. And then the sea rose and reshaped the entire region. Or the submerged continental shelves off India, China, the Americas. If you take a global map and remove the oceans down to Ice Age sea levels, the world looks completely different. Whole coastlines become plains. New land bridges appear. Rivers extend farther out. Those lands weren't empty. Humans had already spread widely by then. So if Dogland was densely inhabited, other drowned landscapes likely were too, which means our archaeological record is missing huge chapters, and we built our origin of civilization narratives largely from what remains on dry land. That's like trying to understand a person's life by reading only the pages of a diary that survived a house fire. Of course the story will look incomplete. Of course the timeline will look mysteriously sudden in places. Now, let's bring this back to Sumer in a more grounded way. Even if the refugee memory theory is only partly true, even if Dogland's influence was one ingredient among many, it still helps explain something that's always bothered researchers. The feeling that Sumer systems appear integrated from early on. Not perfect, not fully formed in every detail, but coherent. Irrigation isn't just an engineering trick. It's tied to administration. Administration isn't just paperwork. It's tied to storage. Storage isn't just hoarding. It's tied to labor. Labor isn't just work. It's tied to temples. Temples aren't just religion. They're tied to legitimacy. And legitimacy becomes tied to cosmic order. All of these parts lock together like a machine. That's what makes early Sumer feel less like a bunch of innovations and more like a framework. And frameworks often come from experience, from remembering what fails when things collapse. Because if you've lived through instability, if you've inherited stories of catastrophe, you don't build casually. You build with redundancy. You build with control. You build with systems that can survive stress. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire conversation. Because once you see the pattern in the past, it becomes hard not to see it in the present. We are living in a time of rising seas. Not metaphorically, literally. Coastlines are changing again. Communities are being displaced again. Slowly in some places, suddenly in others, but the trend is real. And that means the Dogland story isn't just ancient history. It's a warning from deep time. When the sea rises, the map changes. When the map changes, people move. When people move, cultures merge. When cultures merge under pressure, innovation can accelerate, but so can conflict. And what survives isn't always what we expect. Dogland's people lost land, but they didn't lose everything. What mattered most, the portable parts of civilization, could travel, skills, coordination, knowledge, stories. Those are the things that survive drownings. And that flips the usual lost civilization fantasy on its head. The popular image is always a magnificent city sinks, and its wisdom is gone forever. But the real pattern might be the opposite. The land disappears, but the people carry the wisdom forward. The city dies, but the knowledge migrates. Civilization doesn't vanish. It relocates. And it resurfaces somewhere else wearing a new name. If that's true, then Sumer isn't the first civilization in the emotional sense. It's the first civilization we can see clearly because it rose on dry land and left written records. But before it, there may have been other complex worlds, coastal worlds, whose physical remains are now underwater. Worlds we can't excavate easily. Worlds that survive only through faint traces, and through what their descendants built later. And that brings us right back to where we started. Imagine this. What if the first cities weren't invented from scratch, but rebuilt from memory? Not memory in the simple we heard a story sense. Memory in the deep cultural sense. Skills passed down, systems refined, lessons carved into habit, trauma encoded into planning. A people who had already learned at terrible cost what it takes to keep a society alive when nature turns violent. If Dogland's refugees were part of that story, then the rise of Sumer becomes less like a miracle and more like a return to urban life after an interruption, a continuation of something older than the city itself. Now, at this point, there's a fair question. If this connection is so compelling, what would it take to prove it more directly? What evidence would move this from strongly suggested to hard to deny? And the answer is more access, more underwater archaeology, more ancient DNA from key regions, more interdisciplinary work connecting datasets that are currently isolated, and maybe, most importantly, more willingness to accept that civilization might not have one clean birthplace. It might have multiple roots, tangled like river deltas. So, in our final stretch, we're going to bring everything together. We'll look at what kind of discoveries could confirm or challenge this model. And then we'll end with the bigger meaning of the story, the one that reaches beyond Dogland, beyond Sumer, beyond the ancient world, into us. Because if civilization is built by survivors, then every city we live in is, in a way, a monument to people who refuse to stop building even after the world ended. So what would it take to move this from a compelling convergence to something closer to case closed? Because right now, if we're being honest, the Dogland to Sumer idea sits in that frustrating middle space where the pattern feels strong. But the proof isn't the kind of single, dramatic artifact you can hold up in a museum case and say, there, that's it. And part of that is just the nature of the problem. We're trying to trace an influence that may have traveled across continents over millennia through migration, blending, and cultural integration. That kind of thing almost never leaves a clean, labeled trail. But there are types of evidence that could strengthen the case dramatically, if we can get them. The first is the most obvious. More direct underwater archaeology in Dogland. Right now, Dogland is like a library locked underwater. And we're trying to understand the story by catching pages that drift out through a cracked window. Fishing nets pull up tools. Sediment cores show vegetation. Sonar maps reveal ancient river channels. But what we don't have is systematic excavation of settlement sites. If future surveys locate preserved habitation zones, hearths, structures, activity areas, We could learn much more about Dogland's social organization. Were there semi-permanent villages? Did people build large communal structures? Were there storage systems? Were there ceremonial sites? Because the more we can reconstruct Dogland as a complex cultural network, the easier it becomes to understand what kind of knowledge could have been carried forward after the drowning. And just as important, underwater excavations could recover organic materials, wood, fibers, plant remains that don't usually survive on land. That could tell us about boat technology, fishing infrastructure, and resource management in a way tools alone can't. If we found direct evidence of sophisticated boat building or large-scale fish trapping systems in Dogland, it would strengthen the idea that these were people already skilled at managing water as both livelihood and threat. Second, more ancient DNA from key stepping stone regions. Genetics is powerful, but it's only as good as the sampling. Right now, there are big gaps in ancient DNA coverage, especially across certain parts of Northern Europe, the Baltic, the Balkans, and regions around the Black Sea during the crucial window after 6200 BC. If researchers could sequence more genomes from Denmark and the Baltic coast immediately post-Auriga, inland corridor populations moving south, Black Sea-adjacent communities during the 7th millennium BC, early Levantine and northern Mesopotamian populations in the same period, then we could track the WHG signal with far more precision. We could see whether the genetic movement really forms a step pattern consistent with long-distance migration. We could see whether there are distinct founder signatures that align with refugee waves. And we could potentially identify those ghost populations more clearly, turning them from statistical shadows into actual sample genomes. Third, more careful comparative analysis of tool production techniques, not just tool shapes. It's easy to look at a blade and say, that looks similar. It's much harder to replicate the production sequence. But production sequences are like fingerprints, core preparation methods, flaking angles, standardization patterns, the entire Shen operatoire, the step-by-step logic of how a tool is made. If researchers document production sequences in both Dogland region micro-traditions and early Near Eastern anomalies, and find deep structural matches, that's a stronger connection than these blades look alike, because technique is cultural inheritance. You learn it through apprenticeship. It's not something you casually invent in identical form and isolation. Fourth, stronger evidence of cultural blending in the Ubaid period, the bridge into Sumer. This matters because the Ubaid period is where the pieces would have been mixing into the system that later becomes fully urban in Uruk. If Dogland-descended populations influenced the Near East, the most visible cultural integration would likely be in that pre-urban phase. That means we want clearer evidence in Ubaid layers of mixed material traditions, unusual symbolic motifs, architectural features not easily explained as local evolution, settlement organization patterns suggesting unusual communal coordination. The frustrating part is that Ubaid layers are often buried, poorly preserved, or under-excavated. But future excavations with modern methods could reveal more transitional detail. Fifth, and this one is subtle but important, better modeling of how myths travel through displaced populations. Mythology is always tricky evidence because it's not data in the modern scientific sense. But scholars can analyze narrative structures, motifs, and transmission pathways. If researchers mapped flood myth elements across Europe and the Near East and found statistically significant structural alignments, not just generic flood happens, but specific sequences like boat sealing, craftsman preservation, bird release order, that could strengthen the argument that these stories share historical roots. Again, not proof by itself, but reinforcement. And that's what this whole case is. A layered argument where the strength comes from convergence. Now, all of this leads to a bigger point. Even if future discoveries never give us a perfect smoking gun, the Dogland story still changes how we should think about early civilization, because it forces us to confront a blind spot in the way we tell human history. We treat the underwater past as if it doesn't exist. Most of our narratives are built from what survives on dry land, but the coastlines where so many people likely lived are missing, drowned. And when you remove the coastline chapters, history looks artificially sudden, like civilization appeared Out of nowhere, like certain technologies, emerge with no prototypes, like populations mixed without explaining why. So even if Dogland itself isn't the only driver, it represents a broader reality. The oceans have swallowed massive portions of early human story, which means our origin narratives are inherently incomplete. And there's another implication that doesn't get discussed enough. If civilizations can be shaped by displaced coastal peoples bringing knowledge inland, then major cultural turning points might often be triggered by environmental shocks. Not just slow evolution, but disruption, the collapse of a homeland, the forced mixing of populations, the need to rebuild fast. That kind of pressure can accelerate change. It can turn knowledge into systems. It can push communities into innovations they might never have pursued in stable conditions. So now, let's bring this back to the simplest human core of the story. Imagine being one of those refugees. Imagine living in a world you know intimately, forests, rivers, seasonal routes, then watching it vanish underwater. Imagine the grief, the fear, the betrayal, and then imagine the long journey afterward. Not one journey, but hundreds, because it happens across generations. Children growing up hearing stories of the old land. Elders teaching skills learned in a world that no longer exists. A people carrying memory like a flame. And eventually, after centuries, they reach a new landscape, southern Mesopotamia, a place of marshes and rivers, hot winds, unpredictable floods, a place that could be dangerous, but also a place where water can be managed, where canals can turn chaos into abundance, where organization can turn risk into stability, where a community can stop running. And when they settle there, they build with the intensity of people who know what it means to lose everything. They build canals like the ocean is coming again. They count grain like famine is always near. They write because memory isn't enough. They raise temples because order must be maintained. They build cities because together is safer than alone. And whether or not every detail of that picture is literally true, it captures something historically true about humans. Civilization is often a response to instability, not the reward for stability. Which brings us to the ending question, the one that makes this story feel personal. If civilization is built on memory of catastrophe, what does it mean that we are entering an era of catastrophe again? Sea level rise, climate disruption, mass displacement, the same ingredients that shaped the past. Are we watching another cycle begin? And if we are, what knowledge are we carrying forward? What will survive? What will be rebuilt? That's where we land the story in the final parts. Because the real value of Dogland and Sumer isn't just in rewriting ancient history. It's in reminding us what humans do when worlds end. They move, they adapt, they remember, and they build again. There's a moment when you follow the story this far where it stops being about did it happen exactly like this, and it starts being about what kind of truth is this pointing at? Because whether Dogland's refugees were the missing key to Sumer or one thread in a larger tapestry, the pattern we're circling is real. Catastrophe reshapes history. Displacement reshapes culture. And the things we call beginnings are often built on the ruins of endings we no longer remember. That's the first truth. The second truth is this. Humans are not just builders of tools. We're builders of systems. And systems are basically memory turned into structure. A canal is memory. This is how you make water behave. A ledger is memory. This is what we have, what we owe, what we can't afford to forget. A city is memory. This is how we stay together. A temple is memory. This is how we keep order when the world feels unstable. A writing system is memory. This is how we make knowledge survive us. If Dogland's drowning is part of the deep ancestry of Sumer, then what we're really watching is memory migrating. Not just stories migrating. Not just people migrating. But strategies, mindsets, instincts, the invisible architecture of how a society thinks survival works. And that might be the most important idea in this entire story. Civilization isn't just a place. It's a set of behaviors. It's how people respond to risk. It's how they coordinate under pressure. It's how they build permanence in a world that keeps proving it can erase permanence. Now, I want to zoom in on something that can sound abstract until you make it human. What happens to identity when your homeland disappears? Because for Dogland survivors, if we imagine them realistically, this wasn't just relocation. This was the loss of a world that defined them. They would have lost sacred places, landmarks tied to stories, seasonal routes that felt like the rhythm of life, burial grounds, meeting places. Every "we are from here" anchor point gone. When that happens, people don't just migrate physically, they migrate psychologically. And one of the most common survival responses is this. You become obsessed with permanence. You become obsessed with making something that can't be washed away. And Sumer, more than almost any early civilization, looks like a culture trying to anchor itself. They build in mud brick, yes, fragile material, but they build in layers, constantly rebuilding. They create tells, artificial hills that rise over time. They leave a physical record of "we are still here," stacked up generation after generation. They carve administration into clay. They turn memory into tablets. They turn cosmic observation into calendars. They turn social organization into institutions. It's like they're building not just a city, but a defense against forgetting. And that aligns with the flood obsession, too. Flood myths aren't just bedtime stories. In many cultures, flood myths are the deepest anxiety society has about the world. They're the nightmare that never fully goes away. If you've inherited a story that says, water once ended everything, you don't treat water casually. You organize around it. You ritualize around it. You build your sense of order around controlling it. Now, look at Sumerian religion through that lens. Their gods are deeply tied to forces of nature and order. Rivers, storms, fertility, kingship, cosmic structure. Their myths often revolve around chaos, threatening stability, and the need to restore balance. And again, I'm not saying this proves Dogland refugees were there. I'm saying it makes sense that a civilization born in an unstable environment, marshlands, unpredictable rivers, harsh seasons, would develop a worldview obsessed with order. But if that civilization also inherited trauma memory from a drowned homeland, that obsession would be even more intense. Order becomes sacred because disorder is deadly. Now, there's something else we should address, because this topic can trigger the wrong kind of reaction in people. The idea that civilization came from somewhere else. Historically, that's been used in ugly ways. People claiming that certain civilizations couldn't have developed on their own, that greatness must have come from outsiders. That's not what the story is saying. If Dogland refugees influenced the Near East, it wouldn't be a story of replacement. It would be a story of merging. Local Mesopotamian communities had deep knowledge. Farming, animal husbandry, local ecology, regional trade, and their own traditions. Refugee-descended groups would bring different strengths. Perhaps organizational habits shaped by migration. Water fear turned into water mastery, specialized tool traditions, and cultural memory. And the fusion creates something new. That's not outsiders bringing civilization to locals. That's humans doing what humans always do when they meet under pressure. They exchange. They adapt. They synthesize. And out of synthesis, new systems can emerge fast. That's what makes Sumer so interesting. It's not just a set of inventions. It's a coherent framework. It feels like a place where multiple streams of experience converged and then locked into a machine that could sustain a city. And once cities exist, everything changes. Cities concentrate knowledge. They concentrate labor. They create specialists. They create bureaucracy. They create writing. They create history. And here's the quiet, tragic irony. Once writing exists, we start believing history begins where writing begins, because written records feel solid. They feel authoritative. But humanity didn't begin with writing. Human complexity didn't begin with writing. What begins with writing is the survival of certain stories over others. Written civilizations get remembered, unwritten. Drowned civilizations get forgotten. So if Dogland was a complex world, and it seems like it was, then its disappearance would create the illusion that complexity suddenly appeared later in Sumer. Not because complexity didn't exist before, but because the earlier chapters are underwater. That's the third truth. And now, with those truths in mind, we can finally ask a question that ties everything together. If the story of civilization is, in part, the story of survivors rebuilding after catastrophe, what does that say about us? Because we live in a world that is once again entering a period of instability. Sea levels rising, coastal communities under threat, climate shifting, mass displacement already happening in slow motion. And it's tempting to treat that as a modern problem with modern solutions. But deep time tells us something important. This isn't new. Humans have been here before. Not in the exact same way, not with the same technology, not with the same global population. But the pattern of environmental change forcing cultural transformation is ancient, and it will happen again. So what do we do with that? We can respond like civilizations that believed the world was stable. Build carelessly. Ignore the warnings. Assume the sea won't take what it took before. Or we can respond like survivors, like people who remember, even if the memory isn't personal, that the world can change fast. And that survival depends not just on tech, but on coordination, resource management, community, and the preservation of knowledge. If Dogland's refugees carry the seed of cities into Mesopotamia, then the lesson isn't history is a lie. The lesson is history is fragile. Civilization is fragile. And what saves us over and over is what we carry. Not just in our hands, but in our systems, in our shared memory, in the willingness to rebuild without forgetting what caused the collapse. So, in the final part, I want to bring this story home. We'll tie Dogland and Sumer into one clear, closing thread, and we'll end with the most haunting and honestly most hopeful idea of all, that the beginning of civilization might not be the story of humans becoming smart, but the story of humans refusing to let wisdom drown. So here we are at the edge of the story, and if you've stayed with me this far, you can probably feel what makes this idea so unsettling and so strangely comforting at the same time, because it doesn't just rearrange a few dates on a timeline. It changes the emotional shape of human history. It suggests that the beginning might not be a clean sunrise. It might be a shoreline after a storm, a place where survivors stand dripping, exhausted, staring at what's left, then choosing somehow to build again. Let's pull the thread tight one last time. Dogland was real. A vast landscape beneath the North Sea that once held forests, rivers, wetlands, and human communities. Not myths, sediment cores, seabed mapping, recovered tools and bones all point to a thriving Mesolithic world. Then the sea rose, slowly at first, in a way people could adapt to, and then violently, suddenly around 6,200 BC, when the Storiga slide triggered a mega tsunami and wiped out what remained. A homeland drowned, a population was displaced. That part is no longer controversial in the broad sense. The physical event is there. The drowned land is there. What's debated, and what makes this story worth telling, is what happened next. Because in the centuries that follow, the archaeological and genetic records begin showing strange overlaps across vast distances. Microlith traditions and production techniques appearing where they don't quite belong. Pottery motifs that echo Atlantic styles turning up far to the southeast. Symbolic marks and cultural fingerprints drifting along a corridor that seems to run from the Baltic toward the Black Sea and into the Near East. Ancient DNA revealing traces of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in Near Eastern populations in a period where the Near East itself is under climate stress. Mythology preserving flood memory, sudden, catastrophic, boat-centered, in ways that align uncannily well with a tsunami-driven disaster rather than a slow, seasonal river rise. And then, after a long gap of adaptation and blending, Sumer appears, not like a hesitant toddler taking its first steps, but like someone who has walked this path before. Cities with planning from early phases. Irrigation systems that feel engineered rather than stumbled into. Administrative record-keeping that shows up already structured. Writing that appears as a working tool, not a long experiment. Astronomical frameworks that imply generations of careful observation. None of this proves a single, tidy conclusion, but together, it suggests a possibility that's hard to unsee once it's in your mind. Sumer doesn't feel like a pure invention. It feels like a reconstruction. A synthesis built by people who brought different streams of knowledge together. Some local, some arriving through movement, displacement, and memory. And that brings us back to the opening line. What if the first Sumerians didn't invent cities? What if they remembered them? Not remembered like reading a blueprint. Remembered like inheriting habits. Remembered like carrying methods. Remembered like cultural memory. Refined by catastrophe. Becoming a framework for survival. Now, here's the part one want you to sit with, because it's the part that matters beyond ancient history. If Dogland's drowning shaped what came next, then civilization itself may be less of a straight climb and more of a repeated response. A cycle, a world becomes stable enough for complexity. People build systems, networks, ways of life. The environment shifts. Coastlines drown. Rivers change. Climate snaps. People are displaced. And those displaced people carry knowledge into new places. The old world vanishes, but its wisdom migrates. And civilization reappears somewhere else with a new name. If that's true, then the way we talk about origins is incomplete, because the ocean has swallowed entire chapters of our story. Not just Dogland. Coastlines all over the planet. And the tragedy is that underwater worlds don't leave easy evidence. No ruins you can walk through. No walls standing in sunlight. No inscriptions on stone. Just fragments, tools caught in nets, pollen trapped in sediment, myth carried in memory, DNA carried in blood. But fragments are how archaeology works. Fragments are how history works. So maybe the real question isn't, is this definitely the story? Maybe the real question is, how many stories like this have already happened? And we simply don't know because the evidence is underwater. Now let's bring it home. Because this isn't just a story about a lost land and ancient cities. It's also, quietly, a story about us. We live in a time when the sea is rising again. We're watching coastlines change in real time. We're watching communities displaced, not in myth, not in ancient memory, but on the news. And it's easy to think we're too modern for this to matter, like our technology makes us immune. But history doesn't care how advanced you are if your assumptions about stability are wrong. Dogland's people were adapted. They were skilled. They had networks. And still, the sea took their world. What saved the survivors, what carried forward, was not their land. It was what they could take with them. Skills, coordination, systems, stories. That's the real legacy. Not lost civilization secrets, but survivor knowledge. And if you listen closely, that might be the oldest lesson civilization has ever tried to teach. Nothing is permanent, but knowledge can be carried. So maybe civilization isn't the story of humans becoming smart. Maybe it's the story of humans refusing to let wisdom drown. And if that's true, then the foundation of every city, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and even the one you're sitting in right now, is built on the same quiet human decision. We will build again, even if the world ends, even if the sea rises, even if everything familiar disappears. We will remember, we will carry what matters, and we will begin again. And before you go, if you made it to the end, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the map light up with people scattered across the world, connected by the same question. And if you want more deep history stories like this, where geology, myth, and human survival collide, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.